Hello and welcome to this video podcast from BioProcessing Journal. We're glad you could make it. Let's watch the second half of Keith Carson's interview with Brandon J. Price, PhD, which will follow the introduction. Our host is BPJ's Editor-in-Chief, Keith Carson, and our special guest.
As a scientist, businessman, and entrepreneur for over 40 years in biopharmaceutical and medical device industries. Dr. Rice has been a CEO of a synthetic vaccine company, a small molecule company, a stem cell company, a biologic CDMO, and a transgenic production company making human proteins in tobacco plants. So the one thing you mentioned too, you've had so many positions, high-level positions in these companies.
Yeah.
Can you pick a favorite one that experience that you enjoyed the most? Any particular company or
Well,
product?
that was BioReliance. I mean,
Okay.
that ability to come in as even though I'm a scientist, I was at head of marketing and sales, right? And to merge all those divisions successfully and create a common message and to go after a market and set up regional salespeople. My boss, who was the CEO at the time, a fellow named Capers McDonald, was just he really came in, he understood how to organize big organizations, and he had been in California prior in the biotech industry. I mean, that was just a rush of adrenaline. And then I was part of the roadshow team to the company public, and that was in itself a rush of adrenaline, right? Because you're on fancy planes and having lots of meetings every day in Europe or US, which is where we went, and we oversubscribed by 32x that placement, that public offering.
Goodness.
So it was that was a rush, but every job is interesting because it has its own unique set of circumstances, right? I didn't start BioReliance or Microbiological Associates, but I've started some other companies, and they're each unique in not just so much in the technology or the market, but the people that you're working with, the potential customers you're talking to, or clients or whatever. And they're all unique and all fun. But for me, MA was kind of the top of the heap as far as my personal experience.
Yeah. And of course, Quality Biotech did very well and continued on and on.
Yeah, well, Quality Biotech was a testing service, of course, and you mentioned Forrest Anthony. He and I and a Russian fellow named Alex Sito were the ones who started that company in Camden, and now that's interesting because our competitor was Microbiological Associates, and we started up with nothing. I mean, we raised some money privately, and we had some labs in a research institute in Camden called the Coriell Institute, and within about a year and a half, we were at 2.5 million in revenue, and our friends down the road at MA were around 10 million in revenue, so they noticed us a lot, and I became friends with some of their folks, and and ultimately I did move over to MA, but that was a great experience because you were in the trenches, and we talked about the FDA interaction. We were doing BioReliance, or pardon me, BioEast at that time, and boy, oh boy, I remember our first client was a company in California who shall go unnamed in San Diego, and I was in the clients. We were in a meeting room, a conference room, and I was pitching Quality Biotech and our virus testing and our animal testing and all this kind of stuff. And they had a question, sort of an FDA question. And they said, "Well, what do you think about this?" And I said, I thought about it, and I couldn't answer it with authority. I said, "So, well, let's call the FDA." So in the conference room, we got on the telephone, and Janet Woodcock answered the phone.
Oh,
and who was head of BOB. And she
Yeah.
said, "Hi, Brandon, how you doing?" Yada yada. I said, "Well, I'm out here in California." This was because of the BioEast, right? I knew her,
Right.
and she said, I said, "Well, I've got," and I didn't identify the company, but I said, "Here's the question." She answered the question fully
Hmm.
and completely. And they were like their eyes were bulging out of their sockets, right? Around the conference
Hmm.
room, and put down the phone. They got their answer. We got ourselves a big client. And
That's
so that was that was what was important about those meetings, right? And having friends and getting answers for people. That was.
been fascinating to watch them evolve over the decades.
Mhm, mhm.
And I've had wonderful relationships with a number of people at Sieber. I
Yes.
really, even though I did get off into antibodies for quite a while, just wasn't the same trying to develop the relationships with the CDER people.
Yeah, they were a little bit different, and then they merged, of course. But do you remember Bruce Merchant, he's the guy who
Yes.
actually at Sieber, pardon me, wrote the first points to consider document back in 1975, I think, something like that. He's still doing consulting. He lives in Santa
Wow.
Fe, and I've worked with him. He's in his 80s. I've worked with him on some projects even a few years ago. So, I guess us old biotech people just keep chugging along.
It's true. It's a small industry. And everyone seems to know each other. So
Well, that seems to be the case, although I haven't seen the latest numbers, but I think about 25 to 30% of all drugs are biotech drugs, right? And the market is over $1 trillion, so it's in the hundreds of billions. So I
yeah,
wonder, it's maybe small in certain ways, but boy, there's a lot of people working in the industry now, and it
yeah,
has really kind of. It's not just a U.S. centric, right? Europe is very strong. I mean, Lonza and the big CDMOs over there, and Wuxi in China, and so a lot is going on, and it's become really international. And I don't know how the sales are broken down by market. The US probably is still a leader, or North America is a leader, but they're using these drugs all over the place. And they're being researched and developed all over the place too. That's exciting.
you mentioned safety testing.
Yeah.
And one thing that I've been working with recently with the lentiviral vector reference material
Hmm.
is we had a company do the safety testing for us using traditional methods,
Yeah.
and I think a sister company uh, used NGS.
Hmm.
And so now we're doing a comparison of the two. And of course, the industry would love to see us go to NGS, and the regulators I've talked to or heard from uh, are supportive, but you know how it goes. They want to see a lot more data first.
Yeah. Hmm.
So
Well,
how do you see that going? Or because
well,
NGS is so powerful.
yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on that, but I do know that data are important, right? Remember, I was talking about that little meeting where the FDA people would give their little talks. At the end of each talk was a little slide. You may remember this. It was a
Yeah.
picture of the U.S. Logo, United States of America, and the FDA logo, rather.
Hmm.
And on the slide, it said, "We trust in God. In God we trust." Above the logo, below the logo. Everyone else brings data, right?
Data.
And that was how they closed their talks back then. And so I think
Uh,
you need good data, but if you can prove equivalence and with good data and statistically relevant data, I think you can do anything. I really do. So,
yeah, that'll take a while.
mhm,
So we've seen so many things that it would take decades for FDA to finally become totally comfortable with certain practices.
mhm, mhm.
And they certainly have done a lot with points to consider. But
Yeah, well,
um, I'll have to say, at least I haven't heard. the what used to annoy me considerably was the use of, well, we'll take that on a case by case basis,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and it just left you nowhere.
Yeah. Well, that's why you need friends, and you need to be able to call in with they'll be responsive to specific questions. They won't be so responsive to general questions, right? And as to the points to consider, we renamed those at MA points not to avoid because because they were not, they were points to consider, but you had to consider them. You couldn't avoid them. So uh, so it again, having a good relationship with somebody there or having a consultant who really knows the people there is really key to any organization who's going to
Yeah,
develop a drug or a medical device for that matter.
I remember that one of your companies was a stem cell company.
Yeah.
Are you still active in cell therapies?
No, not at all. There was a company in Baltimore, and it was looking for sort of a temporary CEO to help them organize a business plan and to go and raise money and proceed forward. Okay, and I have done that two or three times in my life. Two or three of my CEO gigs were kind of like rent a CEO. And so come down and figure out what in one case we kind of hived off a couple of divisions and reorganized and ultimately sold the company. In this case, they were looking for investment, and so I was there for maybe about a year. They got their investment and they went on their merry way. But I don't know what has happened since then. I haven't been involved with them at all. So, but
Yeah, the applications are so difficult.
yeah.
But
Well,
here you were talking about everything being done with, or things being done with antibodies and
yeah.
fragments
Mhm.
and all the applications there that we didn't have before, or at least it's taken them. I mean, we were talking about using antibodies to target tumors
Mhm.
with drugs back in the 90s, and it took a while.
Yeah. Well,
So
it does. It does, and also there's all kinds of gimmicks along the way too. I mean, when the CDMO industry first started, companies like Damon Biotech and Carrion way back in the early 80s, right? Just after Kohler and Milstein, nobody really had, except for Celltech, had a good expression system, right? But but they had all kinds of gimmicks for increasing productivity. In the case of Damon Biotech, which was one of the companies I was involved with, it was a group of people from Ortho Diagnostics that founded this company in Boston.
yeah,
Our gig, our little secret sauce was we would culture, you had to culture cells, right? Mammalian cells, Chinese hamster ovary cells. And so we had developed a little microencapsulation system so you could increase the density of the cells about 50-fold. Okay.
yeah, I
So
remember that. Yeah,
yeah. And so in a bioreactor, you had to culture cells. But if you could put 50 times more cells in that bioreactor, you could have 50 times more antibody. And it was a microencapsulation system. And of course the capsules were porous, so the liquid, nutrients and things could get in, but also antibodies could get out, right? They had large pores in them. And so there
don't
was a lot
forget
of
that.
gimmicks at the time. And at the end of the day, none of those gimmicks won out. What won out was uh, being able to say put the gene of interest into a transcriptionally active area of a Chinese hamster ovary cell so you could get very high output and have very large bioreactors, 10,000 liters or 15,000 liters. And of course, now it's gone to single use systems and we have much more sophisticated and probably AI driven means of feeding them and monitoring their health and welfare in these large bioreactors. And productivity has gone through the roof. Uh,
I remember when we were all bragging about having a gram per liter.
oh yeah, yeah,
That
yeah.
was big news.
Nobody wants that low these days. So,
You'd have to go back and reclone 50 times.
yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned too that I made a note of a while back is the role of luck in
Mhm,
someone's career.
mhm.
And what are your thoughts there when you mention that?
Well, of course, luck is the thing that kind of happens from the outside, right? An opportunity is sitting there or something happens. What is the real thing, the operative thing going on here is the ability to recognize something that's interesting, suits maybe your capabilities, and the willingness to pursue it and not worry about what you're leaving behind. In other words, jump on the opportunity. I don't mean to say you need to abandon things every 6 months and go on to new, but but when you see an opportunity, uh, obviously your exposure to that is lucky, I suppose, in a way. You got to know somebody or know something that's going on. But when you're in the biotech industry, and as it was in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, kind of a small, almost incestuous kind of industry. You knew
Yeah,
everyone. Go to
yeah.
the BioEast meeting or the bio meetings that we have now, and you know a lot of people. You go around, you visit the booths. There's a lot of luck going on there. And there's a lot of cool things, but to be able to recognize it or to go walk up to a friend of yours at some booth and say, "Hey, have you thought about this?" Or what about this thing you're doing? How could it marry with this? And that's really what it's about, I think. I think in a way, sort of you create your own luck, right?
Yeah,
Obviously, you can be contacted by a recruiter and they want to pay someone $1 million to do something. Well, that would be nice. That doesn't happen
yeah,
very often. Most of the
yeah,
time, your own experience and the people you know, and but again, you got to be. It's like an entrepreneurial thing, right? When we talk about entrepreneurship, one of the key ingredients is not being afraid of failure or not being afraid of whatever people are afraid of, being willing to go out and take that leap off the cliff. Uh,
hmm
so, so I,
yeah,
but, so for me, but then again, I think for me personally, it's been a matter of the fact that I have a scientific background. And when I finished my postdoctoral fellow, I was working on medical devices for years, right, in a university, a new field called flow cytometry at the time. And so I had a good scientific background. I could sort of look and see some of the science. And so maybe I was lucky in that sense, right? Having that ability to kind of look at the science and see something that other people didn't see. But I think more than anything, more than luck, more than good being a good scientist or good business person, marketing person, it's the ability to tell a story, you know.
hmm
I mean, I think that's what makes you successful and lucky, if you will, right? Is the ability to say, take a product or a service or whatever it is and make a story out of it that people understand and can see. Because people don't buy products or services, they buy benefits, right? So, I mean, an
yeah,
old marketing thing. And so, my gosh, seeing the benefits in what you're providing is what makes for a successful career, I think, if you're in an entrepreneurial endeavor, right? Where you got to convince people that what you have is better than what the person down the block has, and these are the reasons, and this is where it's going to help you, and this is why you're going to be successful. That kind of
yeah.
thing.
What's the investment community up to? I know they've gone through stages where it was just too risky and the
Mhm.
return was too far out there for them to be interested. And but obviously they've invested a tremendous amount of money in biotech.
Well, I wish I knew where the investor. I happen to be, a member of investment groups, and what I've seen from that perspective, two or three of them, one in Houston, is kind of in the last 2 or 3 years since COVID and during COVID, maybe pulling away from investments that take, say, 5 to 10 years to pan out, and putting money more in investments where they were a Series A or a Series B, and maybe they had a product they were launching, right? Or they had a product they were doing well with, but wanted to expand to another market, right? And so I think investors in general, I mean, private investors, even in collections of investor groups, and even companies that do nothing but do investment in the biotech space or the high tech space in general are just looking for quicker payout, and I can
Yeah.
understand. None of us are getting any younger, right? And so, and I've made a lot of personal investments in maybe a couple dozen companies over the last 10 years. I've not seen a penny yet in return. Now, luckily, nobody's gone under yet, but but usually, investments are more typical now in the form of convertible notes or safe notes or something like that, right? And
Mhm.
so, and so, the most what you're doing year after year is extending the termination date of your convertible note or whatever, so that they can raise some more money to get into the market.
Um,
Well, these are big markets. I mean, lots of people with standards of living that are rising rapidly, right? Particularly in Latin America, and people are demanding more. And so, and demanding better medicine or better health care or whatever it is, they're better cars, better
yeah.
restaurants, whatever it is, they're demanding more. And so, these are great areas to be. And also, too, many in Latin America, which I know a little bit better than Africa, say, um,
Yeah.
the healthcare systems are more single payer systems like they are in Europe, right? So the government's willing to is once they're convinced is willing to invest, and so I think there's some really good markets out there, and regulatory systems are, while they're advanced and every bit as capable as the FDA, most of them follow the EMA protocols
Right.
for approval, European Medicines Agency rather than FDA. So things happen more quickly. And so if you're Pfizer, right, and you're developing a new drug, a Pfizer will go to EMA, and because they can get approval more quickly, and they can start selling and making a profit in Europe, and then of course they'll both ultimately get around to the U.S. market and get approval. But countries like Mexico or Brazil or other Latin American countries follow the EMA standards, not the US FDA. So you can move things quickly into these markets as
I mean,
well.
by years.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Stem cells, for example. My gosh, in dental, for bone regrowth, they
Uh,
were in Mexico 15 years ago. And I assume they're in the U.S. now, but I'm not sure. But it can be a very important thing to think about these markets. And of course, I don't know, 750 million people living in Latin America, and India, of course, is a great market. So they represent really good markets, I think.
yeah, I noticed you haven't mentioned China.
No, I could. China, but I kind of think of China almost like I think of the US, right? I
Yeah.
mean, very good technology, universities, excellent research universities. Um, I don't know how much China is a market for the US. I don't know. I'm sure you can register a drug with the Chinese health authorities, which are modeled after the FDA. The Chinese FDA is follows the FDA. So maybe it's a little bit slower to get things done there, but I have to admit I'm not as familiar with China. Although the company Wuxi, CDMO in China,
Right.
actually I worked for them and helped them make acquisitions in the US some years ago, and a very sharp company. And and in fact, at the time, and this is like 10 years ago, all of their board members and key senior C-suite people were all Chinese, but had all worked in Europe or the US or other places because they came back to China with that a different mentality. So I'm not excluding China, and it's a fantastic market, but I think it's probably different to get into China than it is, say, India or Latin America or
Yeah, and
Africa.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, and it's important to go with what you're comfortable with.
Well, there's that, but there's other markets that are probably easier to get into. But boy, China's the number two country in population now. India passed them, I think, last year. So,
Yes. Yes.
so, but I But so I'm not trying to, slam China in any way, shape, or form,
Sure.
but just to point out that I think there's a little bit different circumstances there. Uh, and so I think, like Brazil too, uh, you just can't walk into Brazil and set up a shop or set up a factory or set up a company. You've got to have Brazilian partners, right?
Mhm.
And China is like that too. So I would put them sort of in the same camp with regard to the ease of getting into business there.
So if you were to look back all the many things that you've done,
Mhm.
would you do anything in particular differently than you did?
Um,
Your
well,
approach overall?
the short answer is probably not, because I'm happy. Back in the 80s and 90s, when I mean we were talking about a nuclear explosion, right, of
Yeah.
biotechnology, the
Yes.
the average lifespan of a manager, director, and above at a biotech company was a little over 2 years, right? Because there was always a new company with more money, and they wanted somebody with experience, and they'd pay you a lot more to go, as long as you were willing to move from Boston to New Mexico or New Mexico to New Jersey or wherever. Those are transitions I made. And so, as long as you're willing to do that, there were good opportunities out there, exciting people to work with, great new technologies to exploit, and interesting markets. And so, if I had it to do over again, I'd probably do it the same way. But again, it's opportunity, right? You're at the meeting, you meet somebody, and they say, "Hey, what
Mhm.
about this? What about that?"
Yeah,
You gotta have
you
start with
just never
people.
know. You
Yeah.
never know what's going to happen with that. Yes.
Yeah, and also too, let me add something, because I teach so much now about entrepreneurship in the U.S., and I've taught in Hungary and actually in Russia too, but not for about 12 years. But my goodness, the kids are smart, right? At going to the universities, they're smart, they're entrepreneurially oriented, um, and so that's a lot of fun too. And to see that coming, I have high hopes for the future, as long as politics doesn't get in the way. But I think the kids
Politics
are
and
smart, they're entrepreneurial in their way they think, more than I was at that age. And I wouldn't want to be competing with them, remembering
for
myself at
nothing.
20. So,
Oh, now what have we not touched on that you'd like to talk about?
well, no, you've been a good uh, fomenter of discussion here. I really, I think if I were talking to young people, right, who are going to start their career, I would offer the advice that, more so than any time in history, certainly when I was young and when my father was young, technology rules. Now,
Hmm.
whether it's computer technology or artificial intelligence technology or medical technology, to have an understanding of technology. I don't mean you got to have a PhD in electrical engineering, but to not be afraid of it, to embrace it, right? And to learn about it and understand it, even if you're a marketing major, or even if you're another English major, right? To have that, because it's going to be around. It's going to be in our lives. It's going to be in our face. My grandfather, who was born in 1886, never used the telephone. He was frightened. He said, this is going to ruin the world. He died in
Hmm.
1902, by the way. So in his lifespan, they
Hmm.
went from horses and carriages to landing men on the moon. And I remember that and him talking about it. And my father similarly didn't like fax machines and computers and things like that. And I made the decision early on, I'm going to embrace it. Bring on AI, bring on whatever is coming. That would be advice I would give to them, because it's part of our life. It's part of our biology now, right? And maybe more. Part of our biology when we get chips in our head and whatever else is coming next. So I
Yeah.
think it's important that that young people understand this and embrace it and learn something about technology, even if they're an art major, because it's going to be in
Yeah.
their.
We can't get the genie back in the bottle. It's out there.
Yeah, yeah, you're right about that. And the genie don't want to go back in the bottle. It's not going back in the bottle. So, and there's probably several genies coming out of several bottles too. So it's, but I would love to be able to come back 100 years from now, look and see what happened, or maybe 500 years. Imagine
Yeah.
somebody from the medieval times coming into our world today, right? How could they understand? It's all magic. And I'm sure
Hmm.
that you and I would think the same, were we to come back in the year 2500 or something. So hopefully we're all still here. I mean, the human race anyway.
Or at least we survive through the next few years.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's
We
great.
got some challenges. Yeah.
Challenges. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things I talk to my students about. I have a little introductory session, and in my conclusion of that, where I show them about events happening in the world so fast, is that what we're doing is preparing students, you guys, students, for jobs that don't exist yet, using technologies that haven't been invented yet, in order to solve problems we don't even know are problems yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. And we have enough problems to solve that we know about, climate change and other kinds of things like that. So it's an exciting time to be a 20-year-old, and I want them all to embrace that with all due vigor.
And you mentioned again in the conversation we had about you would ask the class members if they had ever considered starting a company.
Oh
You
yeah,
got a very different response from the engineering students than you
yeah,
did from the scientists.
yeah. Well, or from business school. Yeah, actually, if I'm in the U.S. and I'm sitting in a group of with 20 business school students, right? I will ask them, how many of you ever thought about starting your own company or being an entrepreneur? Nobody raises their hands. If
Mhm.
I'm in the US and I'm in front of a class of engineers, three or four or five will raise their hands. Okay, that's a good start. If I'm in Mexico, which is where I live and where I teach more, if I'm in a group of business school, that same 20 group of business school students, about half will raise their hands. If I'm in front of an engineering group in engineering class in Mexico here at Universidad Panamericana, and I ask that question, all of them will raise their hands, and five or six will already have done it. Will have already some little business they're involved in. It's not a high tech thing necessarily, but it's some. So it's uh, and if you did this 20 years ago, as I did in other universities in the U.S., nobody ever even knew what it was about. So times are a changing, and uh, and so
So, so what is overall, what does that tell you? I mean, it's somewhat obvious, but it's not really obvious.
well, you mean the fact that the Mexicans are a little bit more entrepreneurially oriented, maybe than the
Yeah.
Americans? Well, Mexico's a very entrepreneurial society, right? If you're
Mhm.
driving down the street in any big city and you stop at a traffic light, there's three people trying to sell you things, right? You know, everything. They have all kinds of things they're trying to sell you, and they'll try to wash your window or something like that. And and now I don't mean to equate those to science entrepreneurs, but they're entrepreneurs of necessity. They're out there because they got to live, right? And and a lot of the students, and in fact, the university I teach at is has a high tuition, so it's kind of like Harvard, you have to have a lot of money to go there. A lot of I don't know what the numbers are, but in Mexico, I suspect a much higher portion of the population has family businesses, right? And
Mhm.
so, and so if I've had students, I had one student whose uncle was Carlos Slim, which was a nice surprise, and another student whose grandfather founded the largest pharmacy chain in Mexico, which is called Farmacia Guadalajara. And there's like 5,000 of these things around. And they're just from family businesses. And so I think they're kind of a little bit more oriented toward family businesses, but then some who want to do something different. The kid from Farmacia Guadalajara, He didn't want to. He was being groomed with his brothers and sisters and cousins to take over. He didn't want to do that. He was an artist. So he had a different idea for selling indigenous art in Chicago and New York and places like that. So
Hmm.
somehow they're the way they grow up and in the family business, they're thinking entrepreneurially. And that would be how I would explain maybe the difference between the US and say Mexico, for example.
Well, that's really interesting. I think you've hit on something there with the family businesses
Yeah.
and just they're growing up more entrepreneurial than elsewhere.
Well, if you walk down a neighborhood, say you're in Tampa, right? Are you okay? If you
Close,
walk,
yeah, close to
yeah,
Tampa, yeah.
okay. So if you walk around any U.S. neighborhood, nice homes, nice lawns, right? Cool. You walk around a typical Mexican neighborhood, there will be every third house will be selling something. Maybe they're selling tacos. Maybe they're selling used clothing. Maybe it's a little grocery store. They're called abarrotes here, little grocery store. It's just that the families are doing these things much more commonly, and I think that really has a lot to say for how the kids are thinking. You know, as they grow up, in a bit of an entrepreneurial world. So.
Well, and it tells me also that there must be some uh, support from or at least not restricting their growth by the
Yeah.
government.
Yeah, no, no, you don't. Well, also too. Uh, Yeah, probably if you're a regular store, like a little grocery store, you probably have a permit from the local municipality, right? But if you're just selling used clothes or selling tacos or sandwiches, from your living room, the government won't bother you on that. I'm sure
Yeah,
probably there's a requirement. I don't know that for a fact, but I don't think they would bother you because it's just sort of so culturally ingrained. It's ingrained in the culture. This is the
yeah,
way
that makes a lot of sense.
people make ends meet. Or one fellow I know, he has in the street in front of his home a big like a device so you can remove motors from engines from cars, and he can repair cars
Mm.
out in the street. Now, surely the government must not like the fact that he blocks the street, but he's been doing it for years. So,
Yeah,
good for him. And I've had a lot of work done by him. So.
that's great.
Yeah.
That's
So yeah,
great.
I would say the future of the world is the kids today, and I mean, we have a lot of issues, and every country has its issues. But I tell you, at least at the university level, I am really pleased with what I see with 20-year-olds or 20-something-year-olds. So it's uh,
Yeah.
and the other thing is, since when I was in school, there's in if I a typical engineering class down here has more than 50% women in it, which is really cool. I think there's a recognition here and an acceptance here, which I never saw growing up. And I'm really pleased to see that kind of thing as cultural,
Oh,
sociological thing. Yeah.
and a woman president,
Down here, a Jewish woman president, and this is a
Jewish
what
woman president. Yeah,
97% Catholic country. I mean, I am.
says something.
It's interesting, not to get aside on politics, but she is sort of connected to the previous president. They're very good friends,
Right.
and he was very conservative, and a lot of the elite here, you'd say, intellectual elite, didn't like him. AMLO was what he was called, and so a little bit worried about her. But I'm not. I think she's smart. She's won the Nobel Prize in climate science. This is a smart scientist lady who is, I think, going to cut the umbilical cord and do some wonderful things. And I hope that happens. I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
Great. And you're in a perfect place to watch it all happen.
Oh yeah, and many of my friends at my university friends are keeping me well informed about what. And I'm kind of, I make it a point not to get involved in Mexican politics, right? Because I don't really, there's so many parties and so much going on, and I'm not a citizen, so I don't have a right really to be inflamed and aggressive about it. But I'll tell you, it's fun to watch, and I have hopes. Again, have hopes that it will be very good for this country.
Brandon, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and you have such a broad scope of knowledge that I think anyone would want to hear this and see this video. So I really appreciate everything you've done here.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to talk about it. It really is. At the end of our time, we sort of will probably think about what we've done, and I really don't have too many complaints. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you a bit about it. And
Again, thank you so much.
you bet, you bet. Have a great day and
Yeah, you
Happy
too.
New Year, as they say, Feliz Año Nuevo down here.
There we go.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for being with us. We want you to participate in upcoming podcasts. Would you like to be interviewed, share your thoughts, or become a sponsor? Email Keith Carson to discuss ideas for future videos. So long.